On September 13th, 1974, a Friday the 13th as it happened, a demolition crew brought down the finest building any of them had ever worked on. Bill Hutchins, the man in charge, told people afterward that the Ocean Forest Hotel was the best constructed structure he had ever examined for demolition. 10 stories of reinforced concrete, marble columns, crystal chandeliers, ballrooms with ceilings high enough to lose yourself in. It had been designed by Raymond Hood, the same architect who would go on to design Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, and it cost $1 million to build in 1929. That's roughly $18 million today. They auctioned off the woodwork and the crystal before the wrecking ball came. They sold the cups, the saucers, the room keys. The lighthouse that had crowned the roof ended up as a decoration at a nearby amusement park. Then they buried what was left of the Ocean Forest Hotel in a parking lot and built condominiums on the 13 acres where it had stood. That demolition is, in a sense, the entire history of Myrtle Beach compressed into a single afternoon. A place that builds something extraordinary, lets it rot, tears it down, and replaces it with something ordinary, then does it again and again, until the place itself becomes ordinary, and wonders why people have started to notice. But to understand how a town arrives at a moment like that, you have to go back to the swamp. In the 1890s, there was nothing at the coast of Horry County, South Carolina, except sand and wax myrtle bushes, and the memory of a family called Withers who had once tried to live there and abandoned the place after a hurricane killed 18 of them in 1822. The nearest real town was Conway, 15 miles inland, accessible mainly by riverboat up the Waccamaw. Horry County was one of the most isolated places in the state. People called it the Independent Republic, only half joking, because getting in or out required such effort that the county essentially governed itself. Franklin Burroughs changed that. Burroughs was a Conway businessman who had built a turpentine and timber operation with a partner named Benjamin Collins. He was not a dreamer in any romantic sense. He was a man who looked at trees and saw railroad ties, looked at sand and saw real estate, and looked at a stretch of empty coastline and saw something like Coney Island or Atlantic City. He died in 1897 before he could finish what he started, but his sons completed the job. On May 1st, 1900, the Conway and Seashore Railroad began daily service from Conway to the coast. The locomotive was a second-hand engine from a North Carolina logging operation, a wood burner the crew called the Black Maria. The 2 passenger cars had been purchased from the New York Elevated Railroad. When the line reached the end of the track, near a creek where the Intracoastal Waterway runs today, you had to walk the rest of the way to the beach. They called the settlement at the end of the line Newtown. Oceanfront lots sold for $25. If you bought one and built a house worth $500, Burroughs and Collins threw in a second lot for free. In 1901, the company built the Seaside Inn, the area's first hotel, and attached a simple open-air pavilion to it, a wooden shelter where guests could sit and look at the ocean. Then came the question of a name. In 1900, the company held a contest. People wrote suggestions on slips of paper. Mrs. F.G. Burroughs, Franklin's widow, suggested Myrtle Beach for the wild wax myrtle bushes that grew everywhere along the shore. It won. One woman's memory of the local shrubbery became the name that would eventually appear on 18 million travel itineraries a year. Here is a detail that matters more than it seems at first. The Burroughs and Collins Company didn't just develop Myrtle Beach, they owned it. They had purchased the Withers family land back in 1881. They built the railroad, they built the hotel, they sold the lots, they ran the store. They would eventually lay out the streets, name them, build the churches, donate the land for the library and the hospital and the state park. In 1912, they brought in a Chicago financier named Simeon Chapin, who merged his money with the Burroughs brothers' land to form the Myrtle Beach Farms Company. Between the 2 entities, Burroughs and Collins and Myrtle Beach Farms, later merged into Burroughs and Chapin, one family-held company controlled practically every acre of what became Myrtle Beach. They managed the town, in the words of one local account, top down. Very little happened without the approval of Simeon Chapin and his inner circle. This is the founding fact that everything else flows from. Myrtle Beach was not a city that grew organically around an industry, a river, a natural harbor. It was manufactured. It was a product. And the company that made it would eventually decide what to keep and what to demolish, what to preserve and what to sell for the next century. When a single entity holds that kind of power over a place, the place's identity becomes a business decision. By the Roaring '20s, a man named John T. Woodside entered the picture and made the kind of bet that either makes you a legend or ruins you, usually both. Woodside was a textile magnate from Greenville, South Carolina, president of the Woodside Cotton Mills Company, which by the mid-1920s had grown to 6 mills, one of them among the largest in the nation. He had built the Woodside Building in downtown Greenville, 17 stories, the tallest in the state. He had helped develop the Poinsett Hotel. He was the kind of man who looked at a map and saw his next move. In 1926, Myrtle Beach Farms conveyed to Woodside nearly all of its land holdings between the Waccamaw River and the Atlantic Ocean. 64,488 acres, including 12 miles of oceanfront, at $10 an acre. That is $644,880 for what amounted to most of the coastal real estate in Horry County. By contrast, the entire city of Myrtle Beach today covers about 10,700 acres. Woodside bought 6 times the current city. Myrtle Beach Farms wisely decided to provide the purchase financing itself, retaining a mortgage on the property and holding back only the Pavilion site. It was a decision that looked generous at the time. It would prove to be one of the shrewdest moves in South Carolina real estate history. Woodside immediately began building. First, a championship golf course and country club designed by Robert White, the first president of the Professional Golfers Association. White created a 27-hole layout with an elegant antebellum clubhouse. It opened in 1927 as the Ocean Forest Country Club, later renamed Pine Lakes International Country Club. Then Woodside turned to the hotel. He hired Raymond Hood. This is worth pausing on. Raymond Hood was not a regional architect. He was, arguably, the most important commercial architect in America at the time. He had won the international competition to design the Chicago Tribune Tower in 1922. He would go on to design the Daily News building in Manhattan, the McGraw-Hill building, and then Rockefeller Center, the largest private building project in modern history. And John T. Woodside, a South Carolina cotton mill owner, hired him to design a resort hotel at the edge of a mosquito-infested coastal swamp in a town with a permanent population of about 200 people. The Ocean Forest Hotel opened on February 21, 1930. A 10-story main tower flanked by 2 5-story wings. 202 guest rooms, marble columns, crystal chandeliers, elevators, luxuries that did not exist in any other building within 100 miles. The hotel property covered 13 acres, including gardens, stables, and pools. It stood right on the ocean front. It opened 4 months after Black Tuesday. The timing was catastrophic. Woodside had already sunk $1 million into the hotel, and the stock market crash of October 1929 had gutted his fortune. Within 5 years, his banks failed, his Myrtle Beach venture collapsed, and he lost control of Woodside cotton mills to creditors. The hotel, the country club, and the surrounding land were all foreclosed upon by his lender, Island and Company of New York. Woodside spent the rest of his life in Greenville in modest circumstances, largely forgotten. He had once been president or director of more than 20 businesses simultaneously. He died having opened a country store and lived upstairs. Much of the land eventually reverted back to the Myrtle Beach Farms Company, which had wisely retained a mortgage on the original sale. The company that had sold Woodside the dream got most of it back when the dream fell apart. But the hotel survived Woodside's ruin. It found new investors, and through the 1930s and 1940s, the Ocean Forest Hotel became something genuinely magical, not just for Myrtle Beach, but for the entire East Coast. Located almost precisely halfway between New York and Miami, the hotel became a natural stopover for the legendary big bands of the era. Harry James played there. Woody Herman played there. Billie Holiday played there. They would come through on their way between northern and southern engagements and, for room and board, perform on the hotel's marine patio. The music drifted out over the oceanfront on warm nights, serenading the 200 year-round residents of Myrtle Beach. You could hear it blocks away, the best jazz and swing musicians in the country playing for free for a town that barely existed on any map. Meanwhile, down the beach, something else was being born. The Pavilion, a succession of buildings really, each replacing the last after fire or storm, had become the social center of the town. The third version, built in 1923, featured a bowling alley, a shooting gallery, and a dance floor. When that one burned on December 28, 1944, reportedly because locals had been building fires under the elevated ceiling to stay warm, it was replaced in 1948 by a two-story concrete structure that would stand for nearly 60 years. This final pavilion had a room upstairs called the Magic Attic, and it was in that room and on the promenade dance floor below that a jukebox played the rhythm and blues records that white teenagers in the segregated South were not supposed to be hearing. What happened next is one of the most interesting cultural moments in the history of American dance. Young white kids, lifeguards, waitresses, college students on spring break, watched black dancers at clubs along Ocean Drive and brought those moves back to the Pavilion and the beach joints of what was then called Newtown. They slowed the jitterbug down to match the tempo of the R&B records that were playing. It was too hot to dance fast, there was no air conditioning, and the beach music was too smooth for the frantic swing steps that were popular up north. So they invented something new, an 8-step, 6-count partner dance, laid back and cool, that one practitioner later described as a cold beer on a warm night with a hot date and no plans for tomorrow. They called it the Shag. In 1984, South Carolina made the Shag its official state dance. The first National Shag Dance Championship was held that year at a Myrtle Beach club called Studebaker's on the corner of 20th Avenue North and Kings Highway. That building is now a Dollar General. In April of 1954, something happened at Pine Lakes Country Club that had nothing to do with golf. Henry Luce, the publisher of Time, Life, and Fortune magazines, had been kicking around the idea of a weekly sports publication for years. Most of his colleagues thought it was ridiculous. Luce was barely even a sports fan. But he was powerful enough to force the issue. He directed 67 Time Inc. writers and editors to travel to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina by train. They arrived at the Myrtle Beach train depot and made their way to Pine Lakes, where they played golf, sat in the sun, and held meetings in Robert White's clubhouse to hash out what a weekly sports magazine might look like. The magazine they created launched on August 16, 1954. It was called Sports Illustrated. It didn't turn a profit for 12 years, but those 67 editors went back to New York with stories of a golf paradise on the South Carolina coast and the Myrtle Beach golf boom, which would reshape the entire economy of the region, traces part of its origin to that visit. Exactly 2 months after Sports Illustrated hit newsstands, Myrtle Beach was nearly erased from the map. On the morning of October 15, 1954, Hurricane Hazel made landfall at the South Carolina-North Carolina border as a Category 4 storm with sustained winds of 140 miles per hour. It happened to coincide with the highest lunar tide of the year. The storm surge reached 18 feet. The Weather Bureau in Raleigh issued a statement afterward that read in part, "All traces of civilization on the immediate waterfront between the state line and Cape Fear were practically annihilated." In Myrtle Beach, 80% of the first row of oceanfront structures were destroyed. Every pier along 170 miles of coast was demolished. In North Myrtle Beach, Hazel erased 75 beachfront homes in a single night. Across the Grand Strand, the count was staggering. 273 houses destroyed in Myrtle Beach, 120 at Windy Hill, 200 at Crescent Beach, 450 at Ocean Drive, 300 at Cherry Grove. Wind gusts hit 106 miles per hour downtown. Storm damage in South Carolina totaled $27 million, around $300 million in today's money. One person died in the state, which was something close to a miracle given the devastation. Jack Thompson, a Myrtle Beach photographer who was 24 years old in 1954 and who would go on to document the Grand Strand for decades, eventually receiving the Order of the Palmetto, the state's highest civilian honor, remembered that there had been almost no warning. The radio station had gone off the air. Firefighters used a World War II-era siren. Volunteers drove up and down Ocean Boulevard with loudspeakers mounted on their cars. No one expected the hurricane, Thompson said. Hazel is the hinge in the story of Myrtle Beach, not because of the damage itself, but because of what the city chose to become in the rebuilding. Before Hazel, Myrtle Beach was a small-scale beach town, a place with a grand hotel, a pavilion, a handful of cottages, and a permanent population that had only recently crossed 3,000. The town had incorporated as a municipality in 1938 and wouldn't officially become a city until 1957. It had already survived the Depression, hosted a bombing and gunnery range during the Second World War, and even held German prisoners of war at a camp near the train depot, the first wave arriving in June 1944. But all of that had happened at a modest scale, the kind of history a small place accumulates without trying. Hazel ended that modesty. The destruction gave the developers an opportunity to reinvent. And what they built was not a restoration. It was a different model altogether. The vision that emerged was Myrtle Beach as a volume destination. More hotels, more golf courses, more attractions, more visitors, more revenue. Quantity over character. The Air Force had already established a base near the town in the early 1950s, bringing military families and a steady payroll. The base held its ceremonial opening on December 7, 1956, and for nearly 4 decades, the 354th Tactical Fighter Wing operated from Myrtle Beach, deploying squadrons to Lebanon, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf. The base brought stability and population growth. In the 1970s, when veterans mustered out and decided to stay, the city's population jumped from around 8,500 to over 18,000. But it was golf that defined the new Myrtle Beach. Pine Lakes had been the only course in town for decades. After Hazel, new courses began to sprout, and by the 1970s, national sports media, including the very magazine that had been born at Pine Lakes, was writing about Myrtle Beach as a golf destination. By the 1980s, the building boom was extraordinary. Between 1985 and 1989 alone, 26 new golf courses opened in the Myrtle Beach area. By 2001, 87 courses had been built since 1980. At their peak, there were more than 110 courses across the Grand Strand. Here is a number that tells the entire story of what went wrong. In 1986, there were 38 golf courses in the Myrtle Beach region. In 2011, there were more than 110. The total number of rounds played in both years was nearly identical. 3 times as many courses, the same number of golfers. You don't need a business degree to see the problem. The supply had tripled. The demand had not moved. The golf course closures began around 2004 and haven't stopped. Deer Track closed in 2006, Heron Point in 2014, Wicked Stick in 2015, Waterway Hills in 2015, Black Bear in 2016, Heather Glen in 2017, Indian Wells in 2019, Possum Trot in 2019. Between 15 and 20 courses have closed since the mid-2000s. Most of them were bulldozed to make way for residential subdivisions and commercial development. The land under a golf fairway, it turns out, is worth more as a foundation for condominiums. And the condominiums came. They came in enormous numbers. By 2024, the Grand Strand had more than 157,000 accommodation units spread across hotels, condos, villas, and rental homes, a number that puts the area on par with Las Vegas for sheer room volume. In Horry County, building permits exploded, 17,552 in the 2023 to 2024 fiscal year, with a construction value of $1.54 billion. In March of 2026, there were 1,551 new real estate listings in a single month, a record, and 38% of them were new construction. The building never stopped, but what was being built had changed completely. The Ocean Forest Hotel had marble columns and crystal chandeliers and was designed by the architect of Rockefeller Center. What replaced it, and what continues to replace the things that made Myrtle Beach distinctive, is interchangeable. High-rise hotels with rooftop bars, strip malls with the same national chain you'd find in Branson or Panama City or any other volume destination. T-shirt shops selling clothing with crude slogans. A 60-mile coastline that generates $13.3 billion in annual visitor spending, but that many of its own residents have taken to calling Dirty Myrtle. Nobody is entirely sure where that nickname came from. Some think it derived from a locally popular beer. Others point to water quality. The ocean along the Grand Strand sometimes looks brown rather than blue, a result of river sediment and stormwater runoff, and the area has dealt with periodic swim advisories. Some associate it with the nightlife. This was, after all, a place that in the 1990s had dance clubs on practically every street corner downtown, along with enough strip clubs to give the boulevard a distinctly seedy character. But when Mayor Brenda Bethune was asked about the name, she said simply, "It's degrading to the entire community. We're hurting our property values. We're hurting our business community. We're deterring people who may want to come here." The Myrtle Beach Air Force Base closed on March 31, 1993, when the Pentagon decided to phase out the A-10 Warthog. The irony was that the Army wanted to keep the A-10 flying. The decision to retain the aircraft came after the decision to close the base had already been made. More than 3,000 military and civilian jobs vanished. The land was eventually redeveloped into the Market Common District, shops, restaurants, apartments, which is pleasant enough, but is also the kind of mixed-use development you could find in any Sun Belt suburb. Then came the Pavilion. On a day in early 2006, Burroughs and Chapin, the direct descendant of the company that had built the first pavilion in 1902 and every pavilion since, announced that the 2006 season would be the pavilion's last. The reason given was financial instability. The theme of the farewell season was one more ride, one more thrill, one more memory, one last time. And something remarkable happened. Attendance surged. The park experienced a renaissance in its final months, with record crowds coming to say goodbye. Online petitions circulated to save it. The park closed to the general public on September 24, 2006, with a private last ride event held on September 30th. Then they tore it down. The Hurricane roller coaster was scrapped, its trains sold to Kings Island in Ohio. The beloved haunted hotel was demolished. The 1912 Herschel Spillman Carousel, one of only a handful of its kind left in the world, with a single lead horse, was relocated to a smaller attraction at Broadway at the Beach, another Burroughs and Chapin property. The Baden Band Organ, a German pipe organ that had debuted at the 1900 World Exposition in Paris, went with it. The 11-acre site where the pavilion stood, at the corner of 9th Avenue North and Ocean Boulevard, the geographic and emotional heart of downtown Myrtle Beach, sat vacant for years. Some of the nearby businesses that had depended on pavilion foot traffic were devastated. The company that had created the most beloved landmark in the city's history had destroyed it, citing the balance sheet. The same company had, of course, been in the room when the Ocean Forest Hotel was allowed to decay after World War II. They hadn't built the hotel, Woodside had, but they controlled the land it returned to, and they were part of the ecosystem that let it deteriorate until the only option was demolition. In 1973, two investors named Sonny Stevens and Dexter Stuckey bought the hotel. The 10-acre site was appraised at $7.5 million, though the purchase price was never disclosed. They began selling off the contents, the crystal, the woodwork, the fixtures. A piece at a time, the way you'd empty the pockets of someone who wasn't going to need them anymore. Dino Thompson, a local historian and one of the original shag dancers, watched it happen. He wrote about it later, imagining the hotel refurbished, seeing pomaded couples in linen sipping Manhattans on the veranda, the wind in the myrtle bushes, the music from the marine patio. But that was imagination. What actually happened was that the demolition man, Bill Hutchins, walked through the building and told Dino Thompson it was the finest construction he'd ever investigated. And then they knocked it down anyway, on a Friday the 13th. The cost of the hotel, in the end, wasn't the $1 million Woodside spent building it. It was the inability of anyone, the company, the city, the investors, to see it as something other than a liability. They looked at marble columns and saw maintenance costs. They looked at a Raymond Hood building and saw an address that couldn't support air conditioning. They looked at 13 acres of oceanfront property and did the math. Today, the Myrtle Beach area still draws roughly 18 million visitors a year. The spending topped $13.3 billion in 2025. The tourism industry supports more than 82,000 jobs. By any raw metric, this is a successful destination. But in 2025, hotel occupancy fell 3.3% compared to the previous year. The citywide accommodations tax dropped 10.8%. Merchants reported a 40% decline in their revenues. The Chamber of Commerce projected another 3% decline in tourism for 2026 and began talking about focusing on drive markets and value-driven travelers, industry language for people who come because it's cheap and close, not because it's special. Meanwhile, Charleston, 100 miles down the South Carolina coast, saw record tourism numbers. The difference, as one analyst noted, is that Charleston attracts higher-end visitors who stay longer and spend more. Charleston has an identity that isn't for sale. Myrtle Beach has accommodation units. The crime didn't help. It would be unfair to define a city by its worst moments, and it's true that Myrtle Beach's violent crime has actually been declining in recent years, down 17% in 2023 compared to the year before. But the incidents that do occur tend to happen in the most visible places. On April 26, 2025, just before midnight, an 18-year-old visiting from Bennettsville fired a handgun into a crowd on the 900 block of North Ocean Boulevard, the main tourist strip, on a Saturday night at the start of the summer season. 11 people were injured. A police officer returned fire within 2 seconds and killed the shooter. It was at least the 25th gun-related incident in the area since 2020. The shooting dominated the mayoral race that followed. Incumbent Brenda Bethune was criticized for her response. She lost to challenger Mark Crua, who made public safety the center of his campaign. By the end of 2025, a second fatal shooting had occurred on Ocean Boulevard, this one inside a popular restaurant called Peach's Corner, and a string of armed robberies by visiting young adults from Columbia had reinforced the image of a city losing control of its own streets. The locals have a complicated relationship with all of this. Many of the people who commit crimes in Myrtle Beach don't live there. They visit, the same as the tourists. The permanent population of the city proper is only about 42,000. On a summer weekend, the transient population can swell to several times that number. The crime rate per capita looks catastrophic, but that's partly an artifact of a small denominator overwhelmed by a massive seasonal numerator. The phrase "Murder Beach" appeared in national headlines, and the locals know it's an exaggeration. But exaggerations stick when they confirm what people already suspect. And what people suspect about Myrtle Beach is the thing the city has spent a generation earning, that it is a place where quality went to die. The Pavilion is a parking lot. The Ocean Forest Hotel is a condo complex. The first Shag Championships venue is a Dollar General. The golf courses are subdivisions. The ocean, which on certain days looks less like the Atlantic and more like the Waccamaw River, found the wrong outlet, has prompted enough bacterial advisories to make the EPA an unwelcome regular. The 60 miles of coastline that were once empty enough for pirates — Blackbeard sailed these waters in the 1710s, and the coves of the Grand Strand were hideouts for smugglers — are now walled with high-rises so thick that from certain angles inland you can't see the ocean at all. The bike rallies became another layer of the problem. Myrtle Beach Bike Week, which traces its origin to 1940, grew to attract as many as 200,000 visitors each May. Separately, Atlantic Beach Bike Fest, known as Black Bike Week, has drawn thousands of mostly black motorcycle enthusiasts to the area over Memorial Day weekend since 1980. For years, the two events existed in an uncomfortable parallel: the predominantly white Harley Week and the predominantly black Bike Fest, held 2 weeks apart on the same roads but subject to very different policing. The city imposed one-way traffic loops on Ocean Boulevard during Bike Fest that were not applied during Harley Week. The NAACP sued. A jury found that race had played a part in how the city conducted Black Bike Week, though it ruled the city would have taken the same actions regardless. In 2021, Myrtle Beach paid the NAACP $50,000 to settle the case. The whole episode left a bruise on the city's reputation, on its claim to welcome everyone, on the already complicated question of who Myrtle Beach was really for. There is a specific kind of loss that happens when a place trades its identity for its revenue. Myrtle Beach didn't decline the way a steel town declines, with a single industry collapsing and the population fleeing. The population is growing. Horry County is one of the fastest growing areas in the country, adding thousands of new residents a year, many of them retirees from the Northeast and Midwest who are drawn by low property taxes and warm weather. The money is still flowing. The construction cranes are still turning. But ask someone who knew the place 50 years ago, or 30, or even 20, and you'll hear the same thing. Something is missing. Something was traded away. The people who remember the Ocean Forest Hotel remember it the way you remember a person who died too young, not just with sadness, but with a specific kind of anger at the waste. Jack Thompson, the photographer, said the building was what started Myrtle Beach. The 500 workers who built it brought their families and became the founding citizens of the town. The bands that played there put Myrtle Beach on the cultural map. And the company that controlled the land let it fall apart because it couldn't meet the requirements of its insurers. That phrase, unable to meet the requirements of its insurers, is the real epitaph not just for the Ocean Forest Hotel, but for the entire trajectory of Myrtle Beach. At every decision point, the city and its dominant company chose the option that made financial sense in the short term. Demolish the Grand Hotel, build condos. Close the beloved amusement park, free up the land. Let the golf courses multiply until the market collapses, then bulldoze them for subdivisions. Add more accommodation units, 157,000, as many as Las Vegas, until the occupancy rate starts to slip and the Chamber of Commerce has to explain why merchants saw their revenue drop by 40%. The Shag is still danced in North Myrtle Beach. Fat Harold's Beach Club on Main Street still hosts dancers and lessons. The Society of Stranders still holds its spring safari and fall migration. If you go on the right night, you can still see couples in their 60s and 70s moving across a dance floor with the easy, unhurried grace that the dance has always had. A dance born because it was too hot to move fast, too beautiful to stay still, and too much fun to care what color the person was who taught you the steps. But Fat Harold's is in North Myrtle Beach, not Myrtle Beach. That distinction matters more than it used to. North Myrtle Beach has a violent crime rate roughly 1/3 that of Myrtle Beach proper. Many families now specifically choose to stay there. The separation that was once just geographic has become a kind of judgment. There is a historical marker on the boardwalk at 9th Avenue North, near where the Pavilion used to be. It was erected in 2009 by the Ocean Drive Pavilion Social and Shag Club. It tells you that a succession of 4 beach pavilions stood here or nearby from 1902 to 2006, all built by the Burroughs and Chapin Company or the Myrtle Beach Farms Company. It tells you about the carousel and the band organ. It tells you about the shag. It does not tell you that the site sat vacant for years after the demolition. It does not tell you that the company that built every pavilion also demolished every one. It does not tell you that the farewell season drew record crowds, that the people who came to say goodbye were, in a sense, the best evidence that the thing they were losing was worth keeping. If you drive along Ocean Boulevard today in the summer, past the Sky Wheel and the boardwalk and the rows of identical high-rise hotels, past the souvenir shops and the pancake houses and the mini golf courses shaped like pirate ships, past the stretch near 12th Avenue South where the budget motels cluster and the foot traffic thins out after midnight, you will see a place that 18 million people visit every year and that nobody particularly remembers afterward. It is loud and bright and cheap and available. It is on par with Las Vegas for room inventory and on par with nowhere for architecture. The water is warm, the sand is wide. There are deals to be had. 100 years ago, Mrs. F.G. Burroughs looked at the wild myrtle bushes growing along this shore and gave the town its name. The bushes are still here, not on Ocean Boulevard, where they were cleared long ago to make room for progress, but along the back roads and the edges of parking lots and the undeveloped strips that haven't been worth enough yet to build on. They are modest, scrubby plants. They don't ask for much. They were here before the railroad and the hotel and the pavilion and the dance. They'll be here after the last condo tower needs a new roof and the accounting doesn't work out. The site where the Ocean Forest Hotel stood is near Porchard Drive on the west side of Ocean Boulevard. Where Raymond Hood's marble columns once rose 10 stories above the Atlantic, there are now residential units with ocean views and central air conditioning. The building that the demolition man called the finest he'd ever examined is a few feet of buried rubble under a surface that looks like every other surface on the Grand Strand. There is no historical marker. There is no sign. There is nothing at all to tell you that on this spot, on warm nights in the 1940s, you could hear Billie Holiday singing across the myrtle bushes, and the whole coast was quiet enough to listen.